So, reading the Perlez article again and thinking about the way the conversations unfolded on Friday really forced me to think about taking a step back and unpacking a little bit about the way Africa is perceived. There are typically 6 or 7 notions of Africa, and you probably explored a little bit of this in English already, but there are typically 6 or 7 notions of Africa that exist, and each one of those you can see playing out in different ways across, um, even in our day-to-day life. If you ask 10 people what do they think about Africa, there are certain terms they're going to come up with. Specifically, in this case, those notions are primitive and static, that Africa is cavemen or African or women, or Africa is jungle and just. Uh, you have the first person there, and that's all in static, and it's a place that time has ultimately forgotten, right? So that there's no history there or a future. When we think about Africa as being unspoiled, we think about that it's this it's this optimistic view almost of Africa as this place of that similar to primitive and static that time has forgot, but it's also been untouched by Westerners, and therefore it's still pure and it hasn't been tainted. When we think about wild and dangerous Africa, that's when the idea of um Africa is this war torn place. Africa is all jungles and animals and lions, like cities and actual civilization couldn't exist there because it's so angry and wild and dangerous. When we think of utopian Africa, similarly to unspoiled, it's also seen in a positive light in that everything out of Africa is great. Everything going on in Africa is legit, and this is what we need to be striving to achieve. When we think of the term exotic Africa, I immediately think of scenes from like, um, you all probably too young to remember this, Coming to America, where Eddie Murphy was the Prince of Zamunda. FYI, Zamunda is not an actual place, but he was the Prince of Zamunda looking for his bride. But there's where a scene in Coming to America where there's this fancy uh, a ceremony where it's all about the jungles, and it's so different. I mean, all about the ceremonies and the traditions, and they're so different from who we are and what we do in the United States. And then there's Broken Africa, that everything in Africa is just messed up, that there's no way for it to rebound and survive, and it's desolate and it's hopeless. So all of these, you have three that at times are seen in a vein of Afro optimism, and three that are seen at times in a vein of Afro pessimism. And undoubtedly, there's a lot of overlap that exists between these, but I definitely wanted to make you aware of these notions because I think that'll help frame the conversation about what's going on in the DRC and South Africa in the next unit. Take a look at these quotes with me, if you will. Always something new out of Africa. Keeping in mind what we just discussed, what I just shared with you all um, about those notions of Africa, I think you can see them throughout history and a few select quotes. Always something new out of Africa, as in to suggest that there's no history there, or that it's a place ahistorical, if you will. Take a look at this one. Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. And you get a chance to see that these are some of the ways in which people wrote about and described those things that were happening in Africa. Africa has for generations now been viewed through a web of myth. Only when the myth is stripped away can the reality of Africa emerge. As you'll see as we move throughout time, we'll weave in and out of people trying to make you aware of some of the rich history that exists there. And right now, there's all of these myths associated with Africa. Perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach, but at present time, there is none, or very little. There's only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, like the history of pre-European, pre-Columbian America. So think about that. What are the implications of a statement like that in these things that we're reading in the 60s? Because it does have an impact. Let's see if we have any more. There's a desire, one might say a need in Western psychology to set Africa up as a foil to Europe, as a place of negations at once remote and vaguely familiar in comparison with Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be manifest. And this is out of a series of essays, and I'm sure you've seen this name before, Chinua Achebe. So, again, giving you an idea of some of the things that folks thought. I'm like, if we're always setting Africa up with Western psychology against Europe, then what does that mean? What does that mean if it's always pit as the other against what's going on in Europe, right? Far from being a kind of museum of barbarism, whose populations had strayed outside the laws of human growth and change through some natural failings or inferiority, Africa is now seen to possess a history which demands as serious an approach as that of any other continent. So in 1991, Basil Davidson was really pushing the agenda about making sure that we're aware of some of these conversations that have unfolded, that need to be unfolding as we think about Africa, not this place that's ahistorical, but one that's rich in history, and we need to approach it and really demand a conversation around it. So those are some of the things that I wanted to address with you as we think about and address this idea of these notions of Africa. Think about those quotes and the context which they set, and what that ultimately means about how we view what's going on in Africa. All right.